22 hours flying and 22 minutes to present.
Okay, let me just get this up here. Thank you for a great presentation as well. I've got two tough acts to follow here. Okay, 1 second.
Oh yeah.
Which one?
Keyboards, this one is.
I want to do full screen.
Affichage, go to the beginning with A, affichage, and then mode plein écran, with the one down there. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. Oh no. This one.
No, Joan, one below.
Yes. Actually, but I want to do slideshow. So this one.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, okay, that's fine. That's a slideshow. Yep.
No.
This one.
Okay. Sorry. Okay. Right. So thank you. It's great to be here. Interestingly enough, on my very long flight over yesterday, maybe you saw this as well, Javier, the airline magazine advertises 3 perfect days in Quito, Ecuador, which was great. It sort of goes on to talk about how wonderful Quito is as a tourist destination. And this paragraph especially stood out to me. It says, Quito is changing, has changed. Not long ago, the city's treasured colonial district was inundated with street vendors and plagued by poverty. But thanks to Ecuador's vast energy resources and growing economy, as well as an increased investment in its heritage, things have improved dramatically for the city. Okay, so this is quite interesting for this presentation. What I want to speak about today, because my questions are: 1, where did the street vendors go? And secondly, for whom did the city improve dramatically? So basically what I'm going to talk about today is based upon about 10 years of ethnographic research that I've been doing in Ecuador with the indigenous Kisa Pincha. Much of what I'm going to talk about today has been published in a book which was called Begging as a Path to Progress, which came out in 2010. But I'm also pursuing a very new angle for this work, which is on transnational migration to New York City. So I'll present some of this work today and also discuss some of the surprising consequences of zero-tolerance policing in Ecuador. All right, so for my outline, I'm going to present a fair bit of backstory here. And so some of what I'm going to talk about might be familiar to some of you. But I think this context is necessary in order to contextualize this transnational migration. So I'll first talk about the Kisa Pincha. They're from, I'm a geographer, so we always have maps. They're from the province of Tungurahua in central Ecuador. And so what happened was this, due to a lot of lack of opportunities in the village, many began migrating to beg and sell on the streets of Ecuador's largest cities in the mid-1990s. I'm then going to look at zero-tolerance policing in Latin America. And what I'm arguing is that zero-tolerance has become a very powerful transnational policy narrative in the region, including in Ecuador. But I argue that the application of zero tolerance works to justify continued discrimination against the poor, and the racialized and marginalized populations of Latin American cities. And in many cities, including in Ecuador, beggars and street vendors have been key targets of these policies. But I think this is very problematic in Latin American cities where the number of people working and living on the streets is on a scale unheard of in American cities, which is where these policies came from. And many on the streets are not criminals, as they're often presented, but rather impoverished people trying to survive in the only way available to them. And I think that transferring this type of policy to Latin America thus serves to exacerbate inequality and legitimize state-sanctioned discrimination against the poor. So then I'll talk about how these policies have been implemented in Ecuador and serve to push indigenous migrants in particular into more dangerous transnational migration. And I'll conclude by looking at some of the ironies of this. Okay, so like elsewhere in the world, indigenous peoples in Ecuador suffer disproportionate levels of poverty. But before I talk about this case study in detail, I want to clarify that there are also very wealthy indigenous peoples in Ecuador, and many of whom have earned their riches through international trade in ethnic tourist commodities. And Ecuador also has one of the strongest indigenous political movements in Latin America. So I think this is important to mention. And I know in no way want to suggest that this case study is representative of all indigenous peoples across the nation. But while there is some indigenous wealth, there's also a lot of class stratification within Ecuador's indigenous movement. So for instance, in some regions, indigenous poverty rates are well over 90%, despite this active movement of resistance. And certainly for the Quisa Pincha, this is no exception. So as a result of high levels of poverty, particularly since the economic crisis of 2000 in Ecuador, the streets have been overwhelmed by poor people trying to make a living selling anything and everything on the streets. And it's not just indigenous peoples, but this is who I'm focusing on. But as the numbers of street workers have surged, the nation's largest cities have been cracking down on informal workers in order to modernize and sanitize the urban image. And to do so, they've imported these zero-tolerance policing strategies. So my research is based on the indigenous community, which is called broadly Quisa Pincha Alto, as a broader community. In my book, I focus more so on Caluasi. But what differentiates these communities, or this group of communities, from other poor communities in the Andes is that those migrating to the streets have mostly been women and girls. So men have been migrating from this area for a while, but women's involvement in temporary migration is something newer and not as common in the Andes. And B is that these women and children were migrating primarily to beg. And then finally, in response to these punitive urban policies, they've adapted their strategies to migrate to New York City. So the Quisa Pincha Alto, it's a high altitude community in the Andes, situated at about 3,400 meters or 11,000 feet. It's a Quechua speaking community, and the total population is about 7,000 people. The region has very long been quite isolated and inaccessible, and in fact the first road wasn't built until 1992. And up until that point, the only way to get up or down was via a very long and difficult footpath through the mountains. So it took about 2.5 hours to hike up and about 1.5 hours to hike back down. And even with the road, access still remained quite poor, so it still took about 2 hours to get to the nearest town. But the road provided a crucial role in community change because for the first time it provided an easy way out for the community's women and children. So their migration followed almost immediately following the construction of the road. But with limited skills and few employment options within Ecuador's racial and social hierarchies, they turned to begging. Although begging began as a survival strategy, though, it's since evolved to intersect with a few other things, including conspicuous consumption, status, educational fulfillment, and participation in consumer culture. So, for instance, money from this migration has significantly improved material conditions in the village. So in the previous photo, I showed a picture of a house. Houses used to be made of adobe and thatch, but people are increasingly building these concrete block homes, which are considered more modern. Some are also buying trucks, and many are using their money to invest in children's education. So children's education has become a really key factor for migration. So what happened is that counterintuitively, begging became a way for community members to get ahead. But I do want to stress that they remain very poor. But because they work in key tourist districts and in parts of the city that the municipality is trying to modernize and cleanse in order to attract tourists and investment dollars, municipalities have been trying to push informal sector workers from the streets. Now, this isn't common across Latin America. Latin American cities are increasingly turning to punitive urban policies to tackle the high rates of crime in the region, and so-called urban disorder. And many are taking inspiration from New York City's zero-tolerance policing strategies to launch their own sort of iron fist approach to prove to their constituents that they will be tough on the crime that is plaguing their cities. For those unfamiliar with the New York scenario, what happened was that in the mid-1990s, Mayor Rudolph Giuliani and Police Commissioner William Bratton, who then became the Chief of Police of the LAPD, the Los Angeles Police Department, launched a zero-tolerance campaign to crack down on the homeless, graffiti artists, squeegee kids, street youth, and all those perceived as unsightly blemishes on the streets. And these policies took inspiration from the controversial broken windows theory, which suggests that intensive policing of low-level antisocial behavior leads to an overall reduction in crime. This theory has since been widely critiqued as flawed, yet it remains highly touted as a key municipal crime reduction strategy. So common critiques include that the crime reduction in New York also coincided with an overall reduction of crime across the U.S., the end of the crack epidemic, a demographic shift, and among other reasons. But what's happening in a very fast and busy world, politicians are looking for quick fixes and ready-made solutions to urban problems, and so they're often looking abroad for these solutions. And through this fast policy transfer then, zero tolerance has become a very powerful policy narrative in Latin America. And Bratton and Giuliani have also become powerfully symbolic figures as conquerors of crime due to their alleged success in one of America's most notoriously violent cities, New York. So, supported by their respective consulting firms, which are Giuliani Partners and Bratton Group LLC, Giuliani and Bratton have since been hired or cited as the inspiration for policing strategies in Mexico, Brazil, Venezuela, Chile, Argentina, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, Dominican Republic, and Ecuador, just to name a few. They're also backed by the Manhattan Institute, which is a right-wing think tank out of New York, which Luik has described as launching an ideological indoctrination of Latin American politicians. Now, the transfer and implementation of zero tolerance varies from city to city, but notably the Latin American context is very different than the American one, particularly due to lack of resources. As Javier was talking about, high levels of public sector corruption, high levels of police violence, rigid class and racial hierarchies. So its transfer to the region is very problematic. And in many places, it represents a very shallow, selective, and excessively punitive reading of New York-style policing. So what's happening is that municipalities are taking what they like without implementing the accompanying police reforms, for instance, such as, say, tackling police corruption. Now, interestingly as well, in an article about Giuliani's contract to clean up the historic center of Mexico City, Mounts and Curran argue that these sorts of policies are not being replicated because of their success, which, as I mentioned, is strongly debated, but rather because they give the impression of a strong government capable of controlling these unruly populations, such as beggars and street vendors, both of which are required by the state in order to attract local capital. So they argue that Giuliani and Bratton then are ambassadors of neoliberalism, and their success rather lies in cleaning up the city for business investment and tourists. So, for instance, despite Giuliani's consulting fee of $4.3 million, which is how much he was hired for in Mexico City, overall crime rates did not drop. But by sweeping the street vendors and beggars from the streets, they did succeed in effectively gentrifying the area. Also, despite the demonstrated failures in the region as well, zero-tolerance policing continues to be embraced. And again, Luik's written a fair bit about this. He notes that it could because these sorts of policies are ideally suited to dramatizing publicly their newfound commitment to slay the monster of urban crime, and because they readily fit the negative stereotypes of the poor, who are everywhere portrayed as the main source of street deviance and violence. So again, these types of policies are reinforcing racialized stereotypes and legitimizing exclusion of the poor and marginalized, while at the same time demonstrating to constituents that these politicians are being tough on crime. Okay, so Ecuador. What happened in Ecuador? In 2002, the municipality of Guayaquil, and this is just one example, Quito is another, they hired Chief William Bratton as a consultant to help shape the city's anti-crime structure. And the resulting project is very harsh and punitive, particularly for poor informal street workers. So what happened in Guayaquil is that they increased high-tech surveillance, they increased the number of police officers in the city, in the key tourist districts, and they cleansed the streets of street children, vendors, transvestites, and all others who offended these very subjectively defined notions of proper moral conduct and decor, and often doing so by placing them in jail, including kids. Reports of police violence and abuse were numerous, as the city's most marginal residents were locked up and kicked off the streets. I also argue that there is a very clear racial dimension to Ecuador's implementation of zero tolerance. And so again, due to limited opportunities within these social and racial hierarchies, the vast majority of individuals living and laboring on the streets are of indigenous or Afro-Ecuadorian descent. And so effectively, Ecuador's zero-tolerance policies targeted the racialized poor to both cleanse and whiten the streets. And the resulting modern and whitened image of the city became a boon to politicians, and the safer-feeling city was understood as being more welcoming to investors and, again, tourists. So what I think is happening is that race and hygiene and urban aesthetics became intertwined to justify the displacement of indigenous street vendors and beggars for the sake of tourism and global investment. Okay, so pushing the racialized poor, though, out of the city really does nothing to alleviate the conditions that are forcing them onto the streets to begin with. So it's merely sanitizing the streets to give the impression of a modern city. Meanwhile, indigenous people's poverty persists, forcing some to engage in more dangerous activities. So what happened with the Quisa Pincha is that many of them were no longer able to earn a decent living on the streets, and because they have few other marketable skills, they began turning to transnational migration. In 2005, a handful of women and children began migrating to the streets of Colombia. Now, Colombia has launched its own cleansing strategy, but it's being framed differently. But notably, some women had their kids temporarily seized by the Colombian authorities, and not that many are going there now. In 2007, the first Quisa Pincha migrants left for New York City. And by 2010, transnational migration to New York City had become the most favorable option for the Quisa Pincha, despite the tremendous costs and hazards of doing so. So if you go to Quito or Guayaquil now, there's very few Quisa Pincha on the streets anymore, at least comparatively speaking, very few. So again, I'm arguing that these punitive urban policies in Ecuador have exacerbated Quisa Pincha poverty and pushed them into much more hazardous conditions. So they're migrating to become undocumented workers in Brooklyn, New York. This is a photo outside of some apartments where they're living in Bushwick. Men are working in construction and as dishwashers, and women are working in slaughterhouses and as cleaners. The living conditions are difficult in Brooklyn, although they're certainly cosmetically superior to their adobe homes in Ecuador. But you know, life is difficult. They're working 6 to 7 days a week, have very little time off, very long days. And many migrants describe to me how depression is a part of their life now in New York. They state that the psychological damage of their journeys has been intense, and most of them are coming with coyotes or people smugglers, who are notorious for human rights abuses. There's now more than 100 Quisa Pincha in Brooklyn, with more arriving every month. And most are between the ages of 15 to 35, and many are leaving very young children behind. So I think the impacts on the community will be very significant, culturally, materially, and emotionally. Quisa Pincha also said that they're migrating because of the limited opportunities in Ecuador. They say that no matter how hard they work, they simply cannot get ahead. And they need money if they hope to educate their children and provide them with better opportunities, because this is viewed as the route to success, whether that's true or not. Hard to know. But perhaps surprisingly also, many have also bought into this false promise of the American dream. So they're consuming media images of America from television and from movies, and have trouble reconciling these images with the words of migrants in Brooklyn who are telling them, don't come, life is really hard here and it's not worth the risk. But the ones back home see the material impacts of these remittances on migrant families in terms of their new trucks and their more modern houses, their American clothing and gear, and they believe that these migrants must be lying to them in order to keep their families poor. So consequently, many have taken on this tremendous risk and debt to come. But many of their journeys have been as long as 3 months, because they're coming from Ecuador. The earliest migrants came by boat. They described how they journeyed on fishing boats that were made for about 15 to 20 people, but instead they were filled with 125. They traveled on these boats for 2 weeks, covering the distance between Ecuador and Guatemala, and during that time had very little food, very little water, and were forced to stay in the hold so that they wouldn't be seen. Others described being lost in the desert for 4 days without food or water, which, as you can imagine, is pretty horrible. So some describe their journeys as literally between life and death. And more worryingly, others have faced death. So in 2010, members of Mexico's Zeta cartel kidnapped and then massacred 72 migrants in Mexico. And two of the victims were a young Quisa Pincha woman. One was 18 and the other was 21. And that article over there is the funeral for two of the women in Quisa Pincha. And both of these women, they left their young children behind as they journeyed to, have a better life. And actually, this is a photo of their house that I took, and I just wanted to show. I mean, they're coming from very, very modest means and taking these tremendous risks to do this. And this is not an isolated incident because the cartels are increasingly preying upon migrants because they're perceived as easy targets. And that article says in a 6-month period, there's 11,000 migrants in Mexico that were abducted by the cartels. So these, I think, are some of the unintended consequences of zero-tolerance policing in Ecuador. While Ecuador's streets may be clean, the life circumstances of those removed from the streets are significantly worse. And they have not improved dramatically, as this magazine would suggest. So, unanticipated then, within within the transnational flow of zero-tolerance policy is the transnational flow of undocumented people. As policies become harsher on the streets of Latin American cities, marginalized residents are seeking alternatives, and fleeing the iron fist of the state is deemed a more reasonable option for some. So quite ironically then, the punitive zero-tolerance policies originally devised to cleanse the streets of New York City may have unwittingly resulted in pushing undocumented migrants to the streets of New York City. And so many of the men from Quisa Pincha are literally sitting on the streets in front of big box stores like Home Depot, big box construction stores, looking for work. And I wonder what Giuliani would think of this. If his policies imported to Ecuador have then resulted in bringing undocumented Ecuadorians to the streets of New York in search of work. Moreover, zero tolerance in Latin America has mutated through its implementation to become much more punitive than intended. Deep social and racial inequalities, high levels of police violence, and chronically underfunded police forces have resulted in an approach that goes above and beyond punitive strategies employed in the U.S. And in the end, I believe that it represents a very vicious assault on the poor and the deepening marginalization of young people, particularly those of indigenous and Afro-Ecuadorian descent. Thank you.
Thank you also for the accurate use of time. We have now some time for questions, please. Go
I
ahead.
might have missed it, but why they chose New York? Why did they go to New York? And is it the only place or prior place? So could you tell us more about the broader picture?
Right. So Ecuadorians have a long history of migrating. There's a lot of Ecuadorians already that are in U.S., that are also in Spain, that are also in Italy. But for the Quisa Pincha, New York, I think it's probably the easiest to get to because you can actually, it's in the Americas. And so it just seems, and there's a well-trodden route of migrants that are already there. There are some indigenous people from southern Ecuador that are already there, but they've been migrating since about the 70s or 80s. So I think it's just because there's already these social connections that allow that, or social networks that allow it to happen.
I imagine not all of the floating population that is rejected through this harsh policing goes into migration. Some of them return to their rural communities. So is there a forced return migration to the rural community, or have they, because they've lost any means of support back home, find themselves simply being pushed from one neighborhood of Quito into another?
Yeah, I mean, it's always been a temporary migration. And so some people, usually when they go to the city, they rent apartments and kind of have those shared. And so people might go for 2 weeks, 1 week, a month at a time, going back and forth. What's happening is that, I mean, I was there last summer, and in terms of the Quisa Pincha, there really aren't that many on the streets anymore. So there's still some, but they are having to work outside of the key tourist districts, I would say. And they're just getting moved on more regularly, so it's just harder to earn an income. And I think what's happening is that those...
But they remain in the city. They don't go back to their...
both. It's sort of the same pattern, but there are some people that are actually, I think because they're starting to get some money from the remittances now, they're staying in Quito so their kids can go to school in Quito. Because they believe that they will get a better education. Their kids will get a better education in the city than they would in rural areas. And so I would say there's actually more people that are starting to stay there, but they're not working on the streets so much. They're relying now on these remittances.
So it's the money coming from New York that's taking them off the streets.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's interesting. I think, in terms of the impacts of these punitive policies, I mean, I feel that their lives in New York are certainly worse, but the lives of those in Ecuador are materially improving. So generationally, I think the next generation will be better off, but certainly for this generation that's there now, their lives are very hard. So what I intend to do, I mean, I'm going to continue with this work over the next years and just sort of see if I can. I think that it's going to be completely transformative, and how the community changes, kids will start going to school, and it seems to me as well, because of the state has never really done much for them anyway, and I think it's just people are kind of trying to take the matter into their own hands and do what they can to get ahead. And this seems to be a way to do so.
Okay, we have 3 questions. Eduardo, please.
I was very interesting.
Yeah, if people can introduce themselves, because I don't think some of us know most people, but most people don't know everybody. So when you ask questions, if you just say your name.
I'm Eduardo Marques from the University of São Paulo, from the Political Science Department of the University of São Paulo. And it's very, I liked very much your presentation, but I was trying to compare the situation with the Brazilian situation of international migration to the States, which is very strong. And in our case, there are several studies showing that the persons who migrate are not the poor, are low middle class, white collar workers with some education and some money to make the transition to the States, and they locate themselves down there, but they were not exactly in the same position in the Brazilian social structure. They were better off than the poorer, because the poorer do not have the skills or the money to do this step.
Right.
So I would like you to comment on that and the difference between the different situations.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I've heard comments in Ecuador that this group of people could possibly be migrating because they're very poor. I mean, they're sort of at the bottom of the hierarchy in terms of, because they're beggars. A lot of, so they're very low on the social status hierarchy. But interestingly, the people who are migrating from this community are the community's leaders. So basically, the best and the brightest from Quisa Beach Alto are the ones that are going. Which will also have a very strong impact on things in the year to come. I mean, at this point, I'd say the vast majority intend to return home. So that I think most leave with the intention of going for 5 years and then coming back. But I don't know if that's going to happen. So, for instance, a friend in Ecuador or in New York, his brother just migrated here from Ecuador, and he got caught in Arizona, and he was in a detention center. In order to get him out, this man had to put up a bond for $9,000, and he did it. And now, to get that $9,000, he'd have to probably take out another predatory loan in New York. And so now he's going to have to, he'll have to stay to pay off that loan. And some kids are also, I say kids, I mean they're early 20s, but they're having babies in New York now too. And so there's maybe about 10 children under 3, I'd say, that have been born in New York. And so this is also going to change things. People are going to stay. And I think this is how a lot of migration starts as well. People come with the intention for going for 5 years, but then they start developing roots in this new place, and then they're forced to stay longer. I don't know. I mean, so yeah. So they're at a very, and the previous migrants were all sort of upper, well, arguably from a slightly higher social status. So that makes it a little bit different as well that they're doing this. But they're taking on tremendous loans. The first migrants paid $18,500 to get smuggled here. Current migrants are paying about $8,500 because they fly to Guatemala instead of taking the boat. But it's a lot of money. It takes a long time to pay off.
Janos,
Yeah.
can you please?
So Dani for Budapest. Besides criminalizing and penetrating the poor, I have seen huge neighborhoods in shanty towns of Quito and especially Guayaquil, which were built by the state. This is pretty much unique that the state invests in shanty towns. Do you know anything about this state policy?
Not so much about that. No, I don't. I mean, I think there's always contradictions in terms of state policies. And also, I should mention, a lot of these are municipal policies as opposed to federal level. So they're coming from the municipalities, the zero tolerance policies. But maybe the shanties. I don't know that much about the shanties on the outskirts. This community is about 4 to 6 hour drive from Quito, and it's up in the end.
Okay. Your question, please. You don't want? Okay. So,
I just had a quick question about the last statement in the list of ironies. I'm sorry, my name is Catherine Rajapu Dowd. I'm in the Politics Department at the University of Oxford and based here. And I just wondered about this last point that the rolling out of zero tolerance in Latin America has consequences far in excess of those originally envisaged in the New York case. And I was just wondering when you were saying that, whether there isn't any evidence or critique which might suggest otherwise, that actually the consequences, even in the New York case of zero tolerance, have been very far-reaching in terms of deepening social and racial inequality. I'm thinking very much in terms of Loic's earlier statements at the end of his paper. I just wondered what your thoughts on that beyond the irony that you initially suggest.
Right. Well, I mean, I think the New York case is also obviously very punitive, and there's high levels of police violence and high levels of racial profiling, and very problematic as well, certainly. But I just feel in Latin America, because of the very different context, it just ends up being excessively punitive. And I think, I don't know, I mean, you look at Brazil, for instance, as well. I mean, we've written about Brazil too, but I mean, it's whether there's also zero tolerance policies that are being implemented there. I just think it ends up being a very punitive situation. But certainly, I mean, I don't know. It's an interesting question in terms of whether if you trace the New York cases, you'll end up with similar sort of unintended consequences that go far and beyond what was intended. That's a good point.
okay. Thank you very much.